This section is looking at cash cropping. And cash cropping is simply the idea of growing a crop for cash, growing something for export for sale. So if you drive down I-5 going towards Eugene, you look out the window to the left or the right, and you just see rows and rows and rows of whatever. That's being grown for sale. It's not growing for old MacDonald for him to eat himself or to trade with his neighbor or in some sort of village economy of barter. This is for sale, for export, and in our current Oregon economy, potentially for sale overseas, China, elsewhere, right? So these farms are often growing just one crop. That's called monoculture, mono one. So it's just rows and rows, as you see here, of I don't even know what that is. Looks like lettuce or something. So if you have a field of hazelnuts or a field of one thing, it's monoculture. It's a cash crop. So as obvious as it is when you drive down I-5 and you look out the window and you might think, well, of course. It doesn't just happen. Cash cropping is a system installed, and understanding how cash cropping is installed is so essential to understanding the power of imperialism and how much imperialism fundamentally transformed local societies, agricultural societies, village economies across Africa, across the Middle East, across India, Southeast Asia, and the Americas, including the Caribbean. These parts of the world were transformed because of cash cropping. And not only does it transform the colonized world, the result of cash cropping allows for Europe and colonizing states to be enriched and to have a more stable political system. So cash cropping brings money to Europe and brings political stability to colonial states. So we remember this potentially from an earlier lecture looking at the Industrial Revolution, that the Industrial Revolution brought about three new desires. In order to run the factories at full capacity, you need lots and lots of raw materials. So if you're going to have a textile factory, you want to have lots and lots and lots of cotton, reliably and ideally cheap, reliable access to natural resources. You also want places to sell those textiles, to use this case. So being able to sell shirts to Indians, to Africans, who in the past made their own shirts. And we'll see that cash cropping meets those two, and to a lesser degree the third one. So let's get into this. I'm going to lay out a 10-step process for how cash cropping works. First step is that there is a reasonable threat of violence. What do I mean by reasonable? It's not like, oh, that's an okay threat of violence. That it is reasonable that violence will occur. So you believe, if you're an African or an Indian, that those dudes over there, they will use violence. And you, using your own reason, think, oh yeah, it's not unreasonable for them to destroy a village, to enter into a battlefield, as we saw in Sudan, and killed 10,800 people. It is reasonable. It is predictable. When we think about our own country's history with white supremacist terrorist violence through the Klan, right? It is reasonable that they might use violence. So, first step to cash cropping is make them scared of you. Make indigenous people scared of you, and you do that by occasionally using some violence. So you set the table with fear. Second step is you require taxes to be paid not in local currency, but in the imperial currency. So you scare them, and then you say, you got to pay taxes. And they say, okay, I'll pay taxes, but we pay taxes in the local currency or in a percentage of millet or barley or whatever. And you say, no, 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 I don't want your money. I want you to pay taxes in pounds sterling or in French franc or in the Italian lira or something like that. You say you've got to pay your taxes in the imperial currency, and the challenge is, of course, they don't have that. They don't use the imperial currency. So the only way to get imperial currency is to work for the empire itself or a colonial company, like a concessionary company. Now, how do you work for the empire? How do you work for a colonial company? Well, the only way to do that is by doing a job that they're willing to pay for. So if they say you've got to pay in British pounds, pound sterling, and you think, well, I don't have access to it, and they say, no problem, baby, I've got a job for you. If you sell us rice, for example, or work for wage labor in the mines or the factories, we will give you we'll pay you in the imperial currency. And so you think, okay, well, right on, I'll do that. Now, let's pause for a second. Where are you going to do this? Now, let's look at the effect of selling certain crops. Now, this presumes the notion of private property, which wasn't the case globally. In Mexico, for example, you have the ejido system, EJIDO, where there is basically common land where crops are grown, so it's not private property. But let's say, for instance, just to make it really simple, let's say, for instance, this is a place that has private property. So imagine in your mind's eye you have an aerial view of some land. And in that is your house. And in the backyard, quote unquote backyard, you have the foods that you grow to feed your family. So you have a portion of your property is for produce for your own family, and then maybe you have a portion of it for trade and barter. Maybe you grow beans for your own family, but you grow extra beans for sale at the local market. Well, now if you want to meet the imperial currency, meet your taxes through imperial currency, they're not going to say, well, what can you sell us? No, they're going to say, we want X crop, barley, whatever. So now you're going to use part of your yard, if you will, part of your land, if you have it, to start growing this new crop. Okay, so what does that mean? Part of your land isn't for your own food source. Now, the empire will buy those crops or raw materials at a price below market value, and that leads to a significant increase in profits for the empire. Now, why would they buy it at price below market value? Because this isn't a free market. You can't say, well, I think my bushel of corn is worth X number of dollars because I see what it is at the global free trading price, because there's no one else to sell it to you. You have to sell it to certain places in order to get that imperial currency, and they can price fix. So instead of, let's say, I'm just making this number up here, let's say, for instance, if on a free market you could get $10 for it, they may buy it for $5 or $1 or less than $1. And you need to take that because you're at least getting something and you can use that to pay those taxes. What this leads to for the empire is more profit. So the empire, I'm going to back up here, the empire gets reliable access to natural resources because now you're producing whatever that natural resource is. And remember I said ideally you want to get a lot of natural resources to run that factory, and you want to get it inexpensively, you want to get it cheaply. Well, if you can procure it for less than a tenth of what its free market value is, you're in business, right? So if you can get cotton or whatever for way less than you would have to normally pay for it, this cash cropping system is pretty good from your perspective. You get reliable access to raw material for cheap. But we're not done here. Let's keep going. So if you are only sticking with our previous hypothetical, you're only getting $1 per bushel of corn or whatever, and your tax burden is, again, making up a number here, $5, then you're going to need to grow a heck of a lot more corn in order to meet that tax burden. Okay? So, or if you're working in a factory or a mine, and the wage for working in a mine or in a factory is really low because there's no minimum wage, then you're going to need to work longer hours. Or you're going to need to give up more land in order to produce more crops. Now, what are the consequences of spending more time and more of your land growing a cash crop? Well, now there's things you can't do. And now there's food that you can't grow. So let's look at it in terms of this. If you are in a village that the way you have to meet your tax burden is to work in a mine, which was often the case in Africa, certainly in South Africa. Also the case in a different framework of colonialism in northern Mexico under Porfirio Diaz, and you'll look at him next year. You go and work in the mines. So if you work in the mines but you live far away from the mines, you're not coming back after work. You're living up there. And this leads to a breakdown in social structure where the men leave the village and they go and live far from home. What is the effect of the men working far from home? This leads to a breakdown in social structure. And those men include people who are not typically laborers. So someone like myself, a school teacher, would go and work in the mines. Someone perhaps that has a lot of ethno-linguistic or ethno-medical knowledge. So your healers are going and working in the mines. So what happens when a woman is sick or an old person is sick back in the village? Who do they go to? What about your religious leaders? They're out working too. This leads to a breakdown in social structure. Also leads to, in the case of not moving far from home but giving up more land, a situation where locals now need to buy the food that they used to make themselves. And if it's taking more time, perhaps they were producing, say for instance, pottery. Now all of a sudden you need to buy pots that you may have been getting either through yourself or through the village industry. So things that were previously self-produced or locally traded goods, you need to buy. You didn't need to buy them before, but now you do. Oh, so what does that do? That creates a need that wasn't there. And the empire says, you need clothes? You need a pot? You need shovels? You need ironware? You need this? You need that? I've got something for you. And I will sell you these manufactured goods. And what do they sell it at? Above market value. First, under market to drive out the competition, but then over market. Right? We see this actually at grocery stores, for example. Some grocery stores, many grocery stores, are starting to move to sell milk below market value. So actually every gallon of milk that you buy at such and such brand, you're like, oh, this is way cheaper than at the other store. They're actually losing money on it. But you buy other stuff at the grocery store, and so they make up the money there. So the effect of this undermarket milk is you drive out all the other milk manufacturers out of business. And imperial forces did this as well by undercutting local, what we'll call village industries. So textiles coming out of Lancashire were 10 to 100 times cheaper than Indian cloth. And once you drive out village industries, then you can begin raising the cost or the price of that and make more profit. So if we come back again to these desires out of the Industrial Revolution, new markets for manufactured goods. Well, now you have them because things that they didn't need before, they need now. So let's continue. And the cycle continues, right? So if we look at this once again, cash cropping enables it begins again a threat of violence. I really want to reiterate that if it wasn't for this reasonable threat of violence, there would be no fulfillment of this tax obligation. And if there's no fulfillment of the tax obligation, if there's no need to pay taxes in the local currency, social structure stays as it was prior. So cash cropping created massive, massive changes. It is a structure, right? We use this term structural racism. Even if you don't have individual racists, if the structures, the laws themselves are racist, that is called structural racism. Here we have systems and structures, not necessarily a few bad dudes. It's not like this particular French colonizer or colonial official or this British colonial official was mean or punitive, but the laws, the structures themselves created massive changes. And let's look at what it both constructed, that is to say what it built, and what it destroyed. So what it constructed was a tax revenue source. So think of it this way. British are making money, or the French are making money. Just gold coming in. Second is at the industrial level, you have reliable, cheap raw materials. Third, cheap wage labor, certainly in the case of mines and factories. You have the dependence on European markets once there is the need to purchase out of it, right? It weakens the ability to resist. How does it weaken the ability to resist? It weakens the ability to resist because the local lifeways and leadership who may have mounted a resistance are not these powerful networks of villages or individuals within villages, because village healers, the people with religious or medical knowledge, the teachers, if you will, are somewhere else, doing something else, and so this weakens their ability to resist. And then, of course, it does lead to control of local leaders and local economy. What it destroys is local political leadership. I mean, we can think of this in a metaphor in some ways to how we view politics in this country. If a politician or a political leader isn't able to get anything done, they're just ineffective. They're pushed around. Well, we don't want that person. We vote them out. Or we want to vote them out, even if we don't succeed in that election. And same thing's happening here. So if you have a village chief or a headsperson and they're unable to resist the effects of cash cropping and colonization, well, you think, well, this guy isn't worth following, which again leads to weakens the ability to resist. It also leads to a destruction of local structure, social structure, local economic systems, local food systems and self-sufficiencies, local religious and belief systems, and certainly sustainable environmental practices, because cash cropping monoculture does not allow for the soil to be replenished. You're not growing it with what's sometimes called the Seven Sisters. You're not growing in a think the language today is permaculture. You're not growing it with a way that is sustainable in that sense that you can do it year over year over year and it continues. The goal with cash cropping is to grow as many peanuts as you can in a year. Not worry about what it looks like 20, 30 years from now, but grow as many peanuts as you can this year. I just want to warn you or let you know the next image is going to be a little disturbing, is disturbing. Cash cropping is, simply put, devastating. Cash cropping killed. This photo you see looks like people in the Holocaust. I mean, there is a child here trying to nurse with his mother. So this is a photograph from 1877, and this famine in India in 1877 was caused by British policy. So let me run through some numbers here for you. In India, from the year 1000 to the year 1600, this is all prior to British rule, there were 14 major famines. In 50 years, from 1850 to 1900, during British rule, there were 25 major famines. So 14 across 600 years and 25 in 50 years. Now, why do famines happen at all? India is really dependent on the monsoon, and there's always a risk of agricultural shortages due to this uneven rainfall. However, famines are accelerated due to British economic and administrative policies. And the same thing that we see in India, we can see elsewhere, for example, in the Caribbean, in Africa, or elsewhere in the colonized world. So we can link this in with cash cropping because we have the seizure of local farmland to foreign-owned plantation. And Mexico is a great case to look at this. Americans owned more land in Mexico around 1900 than Mexicans did. So local land is being controlled and owned for the benefit of people outside that country. You have restrictions on internal trade. So if you don't have rice because of a rainfall shortage, you can get it from a neighboring state. But under colonial rule, there were restrictions on internal trade, and so that rice wasn't being able to move from region to region within India. You also have heavy taxation. These taxes went up, 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 and as a result of this heavy taxation, it led to part of the reason for the heavy taxation was the British used India and other parts of the colonized world as a kind of ATM machine to pay for military conflict. So the example that comes to mind is the Anglo-Afghan War in the 1830s and 1840s, and then the Second Anglo-Afghan War a few decades after. So the British need money to fight these wars, and they use the colony, taxes coming out of the colony to pay for it. There's also economic policies, kind of boring, wonky type things like exchange rate ratio and inflation rates, inflation policies that led to famines. The other example that comes to mind for me is during World War II, 1842, 1843, Winston Churchill uses Bengal, which is in India, to produce rice for the war effort in Burma and Southeast Asia. So all the rice coming out of Bengal goes to feed soldiers in Burma and Southeast Asia. This led to there not being any food in Bengal, and there was a prohibition of internal movement of food, and 3 million Indians died in the middle of World War II because of Churchill. I mean, that is not hyperbole. Is not hyperbole to say that Churchill was directly responsible through administrative moves for the death of 3 million Indians during World War II for the war effort. And just in case you think this is not, well, I guess to get another reason to think that it's strictly British policy, after independence in 1947, and we'll see this more when we look at Nehru is the first Prime Minister of India. There's no major famines like this after India becomes independent. There are small famines, but they are short-lived in terms of months and weeks, and they don't lead to huge numbers of deaths like we saw under the British, because the British didn't, I mean, hurts to say, the British didn't care about that. That wasn't the goal. In another slide, I'm going to show you a clip from this Bollywood documentary called Lagan. And Lagan literally means tax. And as we see this movie, you're going to see that the villagers are scared of what will happen to them if they don't pay their tax, and their lifeways are disrupted through tax policy. This movie is a sports movie. It's basically like every sports movie. There's good guys, and then there's a ragtag group of mismatched poor folk who come together to beat the rich guys. It's like Bad News Bears and every sports movie out there. But this is about cricket, and you can see it on Netflix if you want. It's good fun. Okay, let's look at a couple last slides here. This cash cropping system doesn't end with imperial rule. It continues after colonial economies become dependent on these single cash crops grown for export. And unfortunately, when the crop fails due to drought, or if, let's say, for instance, you grow peanuts, but another state lowers their price, well, China and the United States and everyone else is going to buy their peanuts from that other country, not you. And this can lead to economic and health effects. So cash cropping continues today, and we can see that these are worldwide processes, and a lot of the stuff that you put in your body, whether it's sugar, or coffee, or tea, maybe not opium, or tobacco, but a lot of stuff like the clothes that we wear are a result of cash cropping.